it is. It's right here. It's right here. I got it.
Hurry up.
Okay, let's go. Now!
So, I finally watched Stranger Things Season 4, and being a history channel, of course, certain things popped out to me. Stranger Things is inherently a historical fiction show, even if the main focus is alternate dimensions and psychic music stuff. But through everything from costume design, hairdos, signs and lawns, gadgets, and especially music, Stranger Things serves as a time machine to bring its viewers back into the height of the 80s in America. And if you don't believe me, just look at how many songs from the show are seeing a comeback after 40 years. But while the American scenes were fun, that wasn't what caught my eye here. Instead, I was fascinated with the scenes in Siberia, following Hopper and co. through imprisonment and monster battles. Also, spoiler alert for Stranger Things Season 4, the prison system that Hopper finds himself in is one of the black holes of history. Known as the GULag, these prisons have gotten more fame from Warzone than from history books, despite killing more people than the Germans and their camps. In this episode, we will be looking at the Siberian gulags in Stranger Things Season 4. As always, remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. Some of the themes in this video, as well as many history videos I make generally, aren't exactly YouTube friendly, so subscribing and signing up for notifications is a good way to actually know when I post. I'm finally getting back into the swing of things on the video front, and I hope to maintain that. So, let's start with the basics. What is a gulag? Well, Gulag is actually the term for a whole prison complex that existed in the Soviet Union, not just a single site, although nowadays it is used synonymously with how we would use prison, as well as prison system, so I will use the term in both ways throughout the video. The term Gulag is actually short for, I'm gonna screw this up, Glavone upravene lagieri. That sounds Italian, or Main Camp Administration in English. If we Google the term Gulag on Google, we see an overly simple definition, a system of labor camps maintained by the Soviet Union from 1930 to 55, in which many people died. This definition, however, underplays what gulags were in pretty much every way. For starters, gulags existed before 1930 and even technically before the Soviet Union. The Russian Empire expanded into Siberia in 1581, and in the decades and centuries following, it became the empire's go-to region for exile. Political prisoners, as well as violent criminals, were often sent to Siberia. The famous author Fyodor Dostoevsky was exiled to the Kartuga prison camp and was almost executed by firing squad before a last-minute pardon to save his life. Dostoevsky described living conditions as horrific, quote, "In summer, intolerable closeness, in winter, unendurable cold, filth on the floors an inch thick, we were packed like herrings in a barrel, but there was no room to turn around. Fleas, lice, and black beetles by the bushel." By the end of the Russian Empire in 1916, 28,600 prisoners were in the Siberian labor camp system, or Kartuga, like Dostoevsky. Vladimir Lenin would also fall victim to the Russian desolation, although his confinement was far more comfortable as he was allowed to correspond with revolutionaries, duck hunt, move about the town freely, and even write a book. The story of the gulags really starts with Lenin. After his exile in eastern Siberia, Lenin moved around Europe before returning to Russia in secret after the February Revolution in 1917, which overthrew the Tsarist government. From here, Lenin reunited with his Bolshevik party, which voted to bring bread and peace to Russia along with a communist utopia, and overthrew the interim government, plunging the country into a bloody civil war. It is here that the gulags truly start. While the pre-existing camps were awful, the Bolsheviks moved towards the idea of using strict enforcement, hard labor as re-education, and terror as means to keep their population in check. Largely spearheaded by Leon Trotsky as well as Lenin, the Bolsheviks would use a newly formed secret police known as the Cheka to round up special prisoners who were seen as possible threats to the communist system. In the Bolshevik newspaper Red Terror, the process of determining the guilt of these special prisoners is laid out in a November 1918 edition. Quote, "We are not fighting against single individuals. We are exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class. It is not necessary during the interrogation to look for evidence proving that the accused opposed the Soviets by words or action. The first question you should ask him is what class does he belong to, what is his origin, his education, and profession. These are the questions which will determine the fate of the accused. Such is the sense and essence of the Red Terror." In the 1973 book The Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a survivor of the labor camps, documents the waves of arrests that filled the Gulag, comparing it to a sewage system. The first wave Solzhenitsyn looks at is during the Russian Civil War from roughly 1918 to 22. Here we get a sense of who was being targeted by the Cheka and the methods of targeting that were used. Quote, "Should we classify among the prison waves all who were done in before they even got to the prison cells? Those whom the committees of the poor took to the rear of the courtyard and finished off right there." By 1919, Russian soldiers who had been sent to help France and Greece in World War I were imprisoned when they returned home, and in the same year they began commandeering food from the countryside to feed the starving cities. This was met with harsh resistance, as the farmers barely had enough food as it was, and reprisals further increased those imprisoned, or finished off, as Solzhenitsyn would say. In 1921, the Bolsheviks went after students, as well as all political opponents. By 1922, the Cheka was replaced by the State Political Directorate, or GPU. I'm not even going to try to figure out how you pronounce that in Russian. And from here on out, they, along with the NKVD, were the secret police that would terrorize the people of the USSR. It was also at this time that the religious figures began to be persecuted en masse. As the war ended, Lenin's USSR began to calm down. Still, almost 10 million people had died in the Civil War, with as many as 8 million of them being civilians. How many of these people were ended by the Cheka is unknown. This calm did not last long, as just 2 years later Lenin died, and by 1925 Joseph Stalin had consolidated power. Among the first things he did was expand the special camps and officially formed the Gulag system. The first official gulags were in the Solovetsky Islands in northern Russia, but quickly expanded throughout the country, creating hundreds of additional facilities across the nation that would help feed the Soviet machine with slave labor. The gulags would be put to the test in 1927 with the introduction of Article 58 into the Soviet Penal Code. Article 58, especially Section 10, was responsible for much of the persecution during the Stalinist era, which said that people could be arrested for saying or doing or reading anything that was, quote, containing an appeal for the overthrow, subverting, or weakening of the Soviet power. As it turns out, the GPU was very creative in how they enforced this. It was often said that every single person in the Soviet Union was guilty of something. People were arrested for a plethora of absurd things, including the now famous tale of the man who was the first to stop clapping for a Stalin speech. Starting in 1929, the de-kulakization of Stalin's 5-year plan took place. I talk about this more in my Ukrainian history video, which you can watch here, but essentially, kulaks were peasants in the USSR who owned any sort of land, i.e. successful farmers. They, along with their land, were liquidated, and many were sent to the new gulags of the East to serve as slave labor to create infrastructure and harvest resources to run the Union. Millions were arrested and millions more starved. As we saw in the quote earlier, individual guilt was not an issue, but rather what class someone belonged to. The men of the house who owned the property were not the only ones taken, but their whole families as well. As Solzhenitsyn puts it, quote, "There was nothing to be compared with it in all Russian history. It was the forced resettlement of a whole people an ethnic catastrophe. In 1937 and 38, the Great Purge occurred, where thousands of communist officials were executed. Still, many regular people were killed and imprisoned as well, and Wikipedia, which tends to undercount Soviet Union deaths for some reason, puts the number at as high as 1.2 million deaths. Solzhenitsyn also tells of the quotas that had to be fulfilled by this time, and the tragic yet darkly comical lengths that secret police would go to in order to fill quotas. One instance in the city of Tashkent saw a quota for 200 arrests come in just as a sweep of the city was finished. The number of arrests wasn't enough, so the GPU ended up arresting all the men aged 7 to 60 in a gypsy caravan that had come into town. Guilt by association was another issue, as not only being family, but also a friend or even having a one-time encounter with someone who was arrested could land you in jail. As World War II rolled around, conviction of the Soviet people lessened, and some were even released, especially when Germany invaded. Conditions at the camps worsened at the same time, and during the war about a quarter of prisoners died, further dropping the population in the camps. This reverse wave was not extended to foreigners, however. Finnish prisoners of war, as well as the people in the Baltics and Poland who had been annexed in 1939, and then later, of course, in 1944, were subject to their own purges by the NKVD. Atrocities still continued in Russia as well, as one awful tale recounts. In the city of Taganrog, a train full of prisoners was to be transported to the depths of Siberia in 1941. The city was almost encircled by Germans, however, and rather than just leave the train car of prisoners, the Soviets doused the trains in oil and burned them alive before retreating to safety themselves. After the war, the absurdity of conviction rose to an unprecedented degree. The usual suspects, ethnic Germans as well as the intelligentsia of the newly annexed territories in the West, were purged. On top of that, any Soviet soldier who had been captured by the Germans and sent to concentration camps was then sent to the Soviet gulags, since they had obviously become spies working for the West. Russian émigrés who had fled west from Russia during the Civil War 20 years earlier were also taken. In addition, sentences for petty crimes increased, and even more people were being jailed than before the war. Rather than a 10-year sentence that was characteristic of the 30s, 25-year sentences ruled the 40s and 50s. Forced relocations through the Baltics expanded as well, and many ethnic Latvians and Estonians were sent to Siberia, while ethnic Russians were sent west to replace them. That's also why you see large parts of the Eastern Bloc countries have large ethnic populations of Russians, since Stalin forcibly moved these people around. Only Lithuania was spared this fate, as Stalin would die before he could get to their country. A similar fate befell Crimea as well, which saw tens of thousands of people forcibly deported because of their ethnicity. Conditions at the camps hadn't improved too much either, as internal surveys found that major camps still had 75% of their prisoners without warm boots. The Man of Steel still had much to contribute to the gulags, however. In 1948, many Greeks were exiled from the Black Sea region, and in the 1950s, Jews were exiled as well, although this was often done under the guise of persecuting doctors and other successful practitioners. You may have heard the story that Stalin died because all the good doctors had been killed, and this is largely true, as in 1953 Stalin died from a stroke, and the flooding of the Gulag came to an abrupt stop. Through the rest of Soviet history, the gulags were significantly emptier, and Solzhenitsyn himself was released from the Gulag coincidentally on the day that Stalin died. Many people were released, sentences were reduced, and the number of people put in jail dropped massively. Soon after, the official Gulag system was disbanded, but a prison camp system to retain a smaller number of political prisoners would remain in force throughout the Soviet Union, and has actually made a comeback under Vladimir Putin. When it was all said and done, about 18 million people had been through the Gulag, 6 to 7 million people had been deported, and overall 15% of the Soviet population had felt Stalin's wrath. On top of that, it is thought that anywhere between 20 and 60 million people died. Despite the economic effort of the gulags, which was a major focus for Soviet leaders, the camps were actually more expensive to run than the resources and labor they provided, despite making up a third of the Soviet economy. This experiment in terror had not even turned a profit. While I wasn't able to find numbers for imprisoned people past 1970, we can extrapolate to some degree knowing what we know about the prison systems. Brezhnev was more hardline, and we also know that spikes in imprisonment after Stalin seem to correlate with Cold War tension. This spike in 1962, for example, correlates with the year after the erection of the Berlin Wall. Knowing this, we can estimate that the imprisoned population in the USSR through to 1982 would remain roughly steady between 800,000 and 1 million people. It's also possible that as the USSR fell into a cynical, sort of lazy phase, that arrests would go down, maybe spiking slightly in 1973 or 74 with the publication of the Gulag Archipelago and crackdowns on the Samizdat writers. These numbers might have spiked a bit in 1983 too, when the Soviet Union saw multiple premieres as well as attention over the Able Archer operation. Things then probably reduced with Gorbachev in power and drastically fall after 1989. For stranger things, of course, we're looking here at 1986 during the reign of Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev was a moderate communist, and while the USSR fell under his watch, that was not his intention. Gorbachev hoped that by liberalizing the Union through allowing free speech and transparency, he would give the communist experiment a second wind. Instead, he figured out the hard way that communism is not compatible with those things, and the whole thing fell apart in 1991. But along the way, the terror and repression that had characterized the Soviet Union for the previous decades faded fast. At the time of Stranger Things, the Soviet Union, as well as the remnants of the Gulag system, were on its last legs, and not much of a threat. I had a very hard time finding numbers for people in Russian prison systems past 1970, as I just said, but I think it's a good guess that with the introduction of glasnost and perestroika around this time, which drastically liberalized freedom of speech and transparency in the Union and thus political crimes, that the numbers would drop and keep dropping for the remainder of Gorbachev's reign. So now that we know what the gulags were, let's look at what we see in Stranger Things and compare it to what we know of the real thing. The first thing we see of the gulags is Hopper getting interrogated, first by conventional beating, then by a method they call the elephant. As it turns out, this method actually did and still does exist. Yay! The gulags housed some of the worst and most creative interrogation methods imaginable, especially during the Stalinist period. Most methods I can't really talk about without getting blacklisted by YouTube, so here's a few poorly made graphics to show what they were. You'll notice, however, that the elephant is missing. This is because the first mentions we see of the elephant actually come from the Second Chechen War, which mainly took place from 1999 to 2000. You'll notice that this was after the Soviet Union and 14 years after the events of Stranger Things, but that doesn't mean that this method didn't exist back then. While most of the communists were purged from the Russian government, many spies and operatives remained, including one Vladimir Putin, who was president during this time. So it's very likely that the agents and practices used in 2000 were also used under Gorbachev, albeit to a lesser degree than under Putin. As for the method itself, it seems to be accurately shown. Victims, namely Chechen prisoners, describe being handcuffed and then having a gas mask put over their head. The air tube was then crimped to cut off airflow, causing the victim to temporarily suffocate. The only detail that Hopper was spared was that in real life, CS gas, also known as mace, would then be squirted into the tube, causing them to inhale it and deal with all the extreme discomforts that come with that. The other thing that might stick out to people is the aesthetic of the room where Hopper is being held in. Rather than a conventional prison cell, we see linoleum and wallpaper. Once again, this makes sense, In the lead up to the first 5-year plan under Stalin, gulags had to be quickly made in an economically efficient way. There are various examples of buildings being repurposed into prisons, such as the facilities at the Solovetsky Islands, which were previously monasteries. It is entirely possible that before this was a gulag, it was some other type of civilian building. The next big thing that caught my eye is the location. As Hopper is dragged off, the commander says that he is being sent to Kamchatka, and that this is one of the worst places someone could be sent. So I tried to see if I could figure out exactly where this gulag would be. We have a few clues, starting with the geographical region, Kamchatka. This is not the name of a camp, but rather a region of Russia. The Kamchatka Peninsula is in the far east of Russia, jutting out into the Pacific Ocean. The area is cold due to Siberian winds and ocean currents, and the coldest it gets is usually around 12 degrees Fahrenheit, although it can go lower than that. Stranger Things takes place in March, which would still be when the peninsula is snowy, although it would presumably be a bit warmer, perhaps averaging mid to high 20s. On a slight tangent, I'd like to point out that it's so obvious to a lot of people, including me, that the actors and producers of the show and most every other show live in California, since no one in their right mind would go without gloves or a hat in a climate like this. Like we know they have gloves and hats and they have access to them, but once, he does his initial escape, he never wears them. Anyways, so I went to see if I could figure out where this camp was and if it may have existed in real life. To start, I looked at the Solzhenitsyn map of the Gulag archipelago to find what facilities were in Kamchatka. While there were almost certainly more, I could find 4 definitive camps on the peninsula. The next clues we have are in Chapter 6 of Season 4, where they lay out a map of the area, and we see that it is actually localized around the major city of Kamchatka, Petropavlovsk. While it's kinda hard to tell exactly where Yuri points on the map, we can tell that it is to the northwest of the city, somewhere near the bottom of the Kamchatka River Valley. As it turns out, that's right around where Solzhenitsyn marks a camp on his map. It would be very hard to get more specific than this for a few reasons, of course. For one, the village they reference, which according to the subtitles and the Stranger Things wiki is named Kirzan, even though it sounds a lot different when he talks about it, does not exist, which isn't too surprising. That being said, we know it's a 2-hour drive from the Demogorgon camp, and can't be too far from the original camp where Hopper finds himself doing hard labor, since he snowmobiled there. On the Google Maps, I checked what a 2-hour drive would look like around there, and if we account for weather and Soviet roads and cars, we can say that the Gulag and the town we see in Stranger Things are within about 100 miles of each other. We also get the clue that the Demogorgon map is between 2 mountains, but that doesn't really narrow it down. Through all of the Kamchatka scenes, the 2 geographic features that characterize the area are forest and mountains. And as it turns out, that's exactly what the area looks like in real life. So besides the vagary, is there anything that actually makes this portrayal inaccurate? Yes, and it's a simple detail, but a quick Google search can prove how inaccurate it is. While Hopper is doing work at the camp, he is in a chain gang making railroads. But there are no railroads in Kamchatka, even to this day. Instead, lumbering would be the work they would do in the gulags, as there was lots of trees, a river to float the logs down on, and on Google Maps we even see logging roads, showing that logging does happen in this area. Next, let's look at another small detail, the number of people. As we said earlier, we don't have a good estimate of how many people were in the gulags at this time, although we do know that it was quite low. The scenes that caught my eye in terms of having low numbers was the one where Hopper is being told that escapes were not possible, and also when he's getting his head shaved and showered down. That's another interesting part of Gulag history, as escapes weren't super common in places like this. That being said, the guards didn't take it too seriously, since there was really nowhere to escape to. The camp would be the only place for miles and miles with heat and food, so any escapees would likely just die, even if they did escape. The last theme I want to talk about here is the theme of dishonesty that plagued the gulags. The main point of focus here is Enzo. Not only is he a corrupt guard who is willing to release a prisoner for money, but when he gets caught, he says that he is there by mistake and he can't let his family think that he is a traitor. Obviously, he is. There is no way you can look at what was going on there and think that he wasn't betraying the USSR. And yet he blatantly lies to himself and says that he is there by mistake, not even to convince his captors or a lawyer or the public, but to convince himself and Hopper. In other words, he's delusional. In fact, Solzhenitsyn talks extensively about how prisoners in the Gulag routinely claimed that their arrests were mistakes. These claims, however, came from another source and from another time. Under Stalin, the people of the USSR participated in a collective lie that the USSR and all of its leaders were infallible. Only bad people went to the Gulag. The state would never put innocent people in prison. Therefore, since I didn't do anything bad, there must be a mistake of some sort. Some hardcore communists even somehow tricked themselves into believing that they had done something awful, and the Soviet system reinforced this by forcing every single person to confess to a crime before being imprisoned. This was a sense of delusion, since we know that the Gulag system and its habit of imprisoning the innocent were well known at the time. Notably, however, this is different from the delusion Enzo has. While he is still terrified of the label that comes with being arrested, he is still actually guilty and lying to himself. Further, the concept that the USSR was infallible had long ended by 1986. Throughout the 70s and 80s, the Soviets became cynical. Most people did not really believe that capitalists were evil or that communism was an amazing idea, but rather just tried to do as best they could. Grand narratives went out the window and self-interest came in. This actually perfectly represents Enzo, a man out for himself without a cause, but still living in an oppressive system that it is the very cause that he should serve. This actually makes the last moment between Enzo and Yuri that much more poetic. Both men had succumbed to personal gain and had no loyalty to ideology, or country, or even people around them, and yet they are able to surmount this selfishness and dedicate themselves to a cause once more. So, in short, how realistic was Stranger Things' portrayal of the Gulags? The geographic portrayal of Kamchatka is accurate, with snow, mountains, and a map that places the general locus of action in approximately the same area that a real gulag existed historically. The opening scenes with Hopper being interrogated in a strange room are accurate as well, and so is the mindset that is demonstrated in Enzo and Yuri. The only real and accurate thing I could find was that the prisoners were working on a railroad, which isn't accurate for Kamchatka. So that's it for this video, everyone. Hope you enjoyed and learned something. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell for more content, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.